Welcome to the CAG Access webinar featuring Dr. Jonathan Plucker. My name is Dr. Julia Nyberg, and I serve as the Executive Director for the California Association for the Gifted. I would like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Plucker this evening. Dr. Jonathan Plucker is a former science, elementary school teacher, and teacher of students who are gifted and talented. Dr. Plucker currently serves as a Julian C. Stanley Professor of Talent Development at Johns Hopkins Center for Talented Youth in the School of Education. Dr. Plucker is also the current president of the National Association for Gifted Children. He serves as the past president of the Society for the Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts at the American Psychological Association. Thank you for continuing to support CAG Access webinars by donating to the California Association for the Gifted.
GC strategic plan talks about changing minds, changing policies, and changing practices. Today I'm really talking about school and classroom family practices. So we're going to be all the way over on the right today. The last slide has all of my contact information. If you'd like a copy of all of my slides that I use today, just shoot me a message and I will send everything to you. All right, let's get started. How demand for skills has changed. So this is a somewhat, it's getting a little bit dated now, but it was created for the OECD out of Paris about 15 years ago now, I think, 12 to 15 years ago. This is a simplified version of it, of the types of skills that students will need to succeed as they move through school, start their lives, etc. This really isn't terribly surprising, I think, for most of us. We've seen this. Things like complex communications, expert thinking. I think of those things basically as how to create, use, evaluate, and communicate information. And I guess one way to think about it is you're in an information industry. If you can work from home now, that's a pretty good sign that your job is pretty much in the information side of things. Making things still important, but being able to manipulate, use, create, evaluate information is becoming more and more and more important. About a third of all US jobs, and this is true for most countries now, the last statistics I saw, it was about a third of American jobs now are what we would consider to be cognitive problem-solving jobs. And this is important even for things like manufacturing. Since the Great Recession, 12 years or so, we've seen this increase in manufacturing jobs, but even those manufacturing jobs are really advanced manufacturing jobs. So instead of building your dishwasher, you're maintaining the robots that build your dishwasher. So it's very different skill sets from even a generation ago. And so things have really changed. Being able to use information to create new information is becoming more and more and more important. So 21st century, proving to be a brave new world, skills and talents that had previously helped us, helped our parents, helped our grandparents, and our great-grandparents need to be rethought. And one of the most important, if not the most important, is creativity. Normally I'd spend like a half an hour just talking about creativity definitions. I thought I'd spare you that today. So I'm going to give you two very simple slides that kind of overview my colleagues and my approach to creativity. The first is that creativity equals old stuff plus more old stuff made into new stuff. That's extremely simplified. obviously, but this is really what it boils down to, is taking different pieces of information, combining them, modifying them, taking pieces away, adding pieces in to create something new, with creativity being something that's new and useful. So I share this primarily to make a not very subtle point that sometimes I'll see people say, oh, content is irrelevant for creativity. Just teach students how to solve problems, they'll be fine. Yeah, but what are they solving the problems for, and what are they solving the problems with? Stuff, right? So the more stuff you know, the more raw material for creativity that you have. And I think that's primarily why people who are more intelligent tend to be more creative. Many studies have shown that now. And it's because someone who's more intelligent is reading more, is getting more education. I think it's about the education and learning, probably more than it is about the intelligence. You just get to know more things. You have more building blocks to actually create something. And then the second important part, this is a somewhat famous Toni Morrison quote. If there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must be the one to write it. So when I first started doing creativity work about, don't want to date myself here, but let's say more than a couple decades ago, I started saying, I wonder if creativity is mostly attitude. And I cannot tell you how many people told me that I was totally, completely wrong. The entire field now, it's rare to hear someone say that it's not mostly about attitude. And I think that one great way to think about it is just think about the last time you saw a bunch of preschoolers together. They're doing imaginary play, they're making stuff up, they're making up songs, they're being incredibly creative. All the cognitive processes are there very early for most, not all, but most children. What changes is their attitude about whether creativity is of value, about what context they can be creative, if they themselves should take the risks to be creative. Those are all attitude things, all attitude and motivation. So what a lot of interventions now focus on is sort of reinstilling that creative attitude into our children. That's really important. And a very important caveat to what I just said, though, is we only have a few studies on this, but students who have grown up within sort of a cycle of poverty, for the most part, don't tend to do things like imaginary play nearly as much as, say, upper middle class students do. And as more and more of our students every year come to school having grown up economically vulnerable, it's really important for us to make sure that those students are having lots of preschool and early elementary opportunities to sort of practice imaginary play. So again, a lot of students have these skills sort of naturally, but we can't assume that every student has them. So again, provide lots of opportunities. So creativity, again, old stuff plus old stuff equals new stuff, generally. And then creativity primarily about attitude. A couple more terminology things, and I'm going to go through these very quickly because I want to get to the to some of these practical strategies. For our purpose today, we're going to be talking about different types of creativity. Big C creativity is what researchers talk about, like solving really big problems. And the general rule is when you see big C creativity, you know it. It's not very ambiguous. The world has lots of huge problems. Here are some. I'm sure you can think of plenty others that we're dealing with at this very second. These problems have to be solved, and they involve an immense amount of human creativity and innovation. Big C creativity. When you think of big C creativity, if I asked you to think of a creative scientist, you'd think of that guy probably for many people. Here's the interesting thing. That's not Einstein. That's the Einstein that you're thinking of. That's the patent clerk that was playing around with theory of general and special relativity. Not the first guy, the second guy. So the danger with big C creativity is we tend to look at the finished products and then extrapolate backwards, and we tend to miss the fact that the super eccentric guy on the left wasn't the guy that you're thinking of who did all those amazing scientifically creative things. It was the guy on the right. And I know you've never seen a picture of Einstein at the beach wearing women's shoes. We don't know why, but he just thought they were so much more comfortable. So there's lots of pictures out there of him walking on the beach in his wife's shoes. Who knew? Okay, we also have little c creativity. And this is just a little creativity that you use every single day. Every day you use little c creativity. You just don't think of it as being creativity. It's the small little problems, the small little things that you do to help you solve the roadblocks that life throws in front of you. So this is little c creativity. It's pretty straightforward. Scholars also talk about another type of creativity. They talk about a few other types. The one that concerns us most today is professional level creativity, or pro C creativity. So this would be taking your little c creativity, using it to solve problems in your job, in your personal life that are sort of professional level creativity. Sort of a way station between little c and big C creativity. Our goal, I would posit, within education is to help students really learn to appreciate their little c creativity and learn how to be productive pro C creativity people. And so that's what we're trying to do. Let me give you a very quick example of how this works. So Dr. Vijay Kakar, who recently had passed away about 3.5 years ago, unfortunately, he was a lung doctor, essentially, a pulmonary specialist. In the early 70s, he had 2 of his patients, after routine successful surgeries, die the next day. And he was very upset by this. We tend to forget that that was very common, literally a generation and a half ago, roughly 30 to 40 years ago. To die after a successful surgery was not uncommon. He is the first person to say, you know what, I think it may be from blood clots that form during the surgeries. And then that's why people die afterwards, is the clot moves through your system and you have heart attacks and strokes. So he began administering blood thinners before surgery to see if that helped prevent the clots forming. Turns out he was absolutely right. A conservative estimate is that his work every single year saves at least 300,000 lives. To put it another way, in the 40 to 50 years since he came up with this, his work has almost certainly saved the life of at least one, if not many, people that you know. So a true big C hero. It is very rare now for people to die from post-operative blood clots because of him. Interestingly, though, his colleagues told him that he was wrong and that administering blood thinners before surgery was only going to hurt more people. So it took him years to convince them, study after study after study, that he was right. So even though he was 100% right, he came up with this great solution. It worked. It still took him years and years to actually convince people. So even big C creativity, when it's slapping us in the face, is really hard to see. I'm going to skip this for time, although it's my favorite painting, so one day you'll hear me tell the story. Let me start here. The first practical strategy I want you to keep in mind is the relationship between age and creative productivity. Simonton's chance configuration theory basically says the more ideas, the better. Creators, believe it or not, are not very good at knowing when their creative work will actually be considered creative by others. It's almost like the lottery, if you will, is that if you buy one ticket, the odds of winning the lottery are not fantastic. If you buy 1,000,000 tickets, if you have 1,000,000 ideas, the odds of you winning the creativity lottery skyrocket. I'm going to skip that. So this is what the standard creative productivity curve looks like. No matter how you measure creativity, this is what it looks like for most people. The bump later in life is especially large for women historically. I wish I could hear you yell out, but you could probably guess why that is. Anybody have a guess? It's usually a woman who gets it first. I know someone just shouted out, "He's dead," and that's actually the real reason. Is your husband has passed away, and God willing, your children by your late 60s, early 70s have moved out of the house. So for women, especially historically, this curve you could almost rotate it on the x-axis, so you see a big jump in creative productivity later in life. So this is the basic curve. It really changes depending on what your field is. So Anne Enright is a famous Irish novelist. In fact, she just published another book, like her latest novel about a week ago. She hit her peak in her mid to late 30s, early 40s. Saoirse Ronan, people within the theater, movies, entertainment on the acting side tend to be earlier. Directors and writers tend to be later. Novelists like Anne tend to be a little bit later. Poets tend to be considerably earlier. Alexander Dumas peaked in his late 40s to early 50s as a novelist. And mathematicians, applied mathematicians tend to be considerably later. Theoretical mathematicians, well, let me just put it to you this way. If you're over the age of 30 and you're thinking, one day I'm going to make my splash in theoretical mathematics, I have some really bad news for you. That's extremely, extremely rare. So that's what it basically looks like. Engineers like Shenzhen Bao, who is a Stanford engineer who's been one of the pioneers in developing organic semiconductors. She's peaking about where engineers tend to. Interestingly, those are the ages at which each of these famous novelists published their first novel, believe it or not. Some of those ages don't even seem possible. Like Mark Twain published a bazillion books. Are you telling me the first novel was at 41? That's actually accurate. Raymond Chandler in his 50s. Laura Ingalls Wilder didn't start publishing until she was in her mid-60s. Frank McCourt, even older. So there's a definite bias against older people being creative. The data, and we've known this forever, is that that's just wrong. It's relevant for our arguments here because young people face the same creativity biases, and ambitious, talented young creator can be a real threat to the adults who surround them, and they are often discouraged. I remember walking up to one of my colleagues. She was a third grade teacher, and I said to her, wow, this student, like, she did an amazing creative project today. And the teacher literally, I'll never forget it the rest of my life, she waved her hand in my face and said, "I'm sure someone else in history has done that before," and walked away and closed her door. One, that's just a horrible teacher. Two, that is the exact wrong attitude, right? Because does little Susie care that someone did that 50 years ago? She doesn't care, right? It matters because it was creative for her. It was different and it was useful for her. That's what our focus should be as educators. educators is not to be harshly judgmental and hold students to these ridiculously high standards, but to be mentors and champions for them. I'm sure you all have examples of amazing things that young people did when they had the right support. The problem is we tend not to give them the right support. I'll skip that real quick. Age brings experience. Age and experience aren't necessary conditions for creativity. It's really important to keep in mind that the young creators within your class need you to be their champion, need you to be their mentor. You have wisdom that a young person by definition can't have. So you can help them navigate people who are harsh critics, people who don't think that their work is very interesting. You can be their champion, and you don't even need to understand what they did, just as long as you can appreciate how creative they've been. Let's do one or two more quick ones here. Group work. Working in groups on a problem-solving task almost always depresses creativity, working in physical groups together. There's lots of social and cognitive reasons why we think that happens. But the fact is that it does happen. There are literally dozens, if not hundreds of studies that have found this again and again and again. Big push in several fields to try to find ways to counteract this, including some very complex strategies. My question is why? If we know that people tend to be more creative working by themselves, why are we forcing them to work in physical groups together? And let me explain. So a lot of surveys tell us that that companies want people who collaborate. And I would argue that's partially true. What employers want are people with good social and communication skills, who are nice people who can get along with others. But they do, when they mean collaborate, they don't mean work in physical groups sitting across the table from each other. Many of us collaborate, well, especially now, right? We're all constantly collaborating. We're not in the same physical space as everybody else is. We're not writing a book together word by word within the same physical space. We're learning how to collaborate. We're using technology to do that. Collaboration is a key 21st century skill. Working in physical groups is not. And the last study I saw that put in a rough estimate on it was that even if students are comfortable working in groups and teams, about 25% of students do not function well in terms of learning, creating within physical groups. That's a significant chunk of students under the best case scenario. Here's what we do. We call it the accordion method. Is we have students get together, and we've done this in professional settings too. We have people talk about the issue that they're trying to solve, and then we have them go off on their own. After an agreed upon amount of time, we have them come back together. We pool all of their ideas. We go through it, and if it needs some more creativity, we send them out again, now with a more advanced set of questions. And then we just keep doing that. It's called the accordion method because I imagine that's what it's like to play the accordion. I've never done it. Group work, collaboration are not the same thing. This is, I was working with some teachers in Utah about 2 months ago, give or take a week, and someone said that the accordion method is pretty close to what the Agile team recommends for students working within groups. I've looked this over a little bit. It does look promising. So there are others out there who are working on this. I've never used it myself though, so I'm not endorsing it. It's just another thing to put into your toolbox. So groups can be more creative than individuals. That's not common, nor is it easy. Interestingly, we only have a few studies on this, but the optimal group size, believe it or not, may be 2 people. And the classic example would be the Beatles, is that they all wrote songs, They either wrote them individually with their producer, George Martin, or they worked in pairs and then shared it with the rest of that group. We don't have any evidence of any one Beatles song being written by more than two people at any given time. So pairs seems to be the optimal team size if you're going to have people work within physical groups. I think it's really important, since you don't get to choose what your working conditions are later in life. I think it's really important that you focus on providing students with lots of different grouping and teaming and individual options, collaboration options, so they can practice. Okay, if I'm working with one other person, here's how I have to do it. If I'm working with a 6-person group, boy, we have to learn to delegate, et cetera, et cetera. So just being more deliberate and intentional about group size when you're doing creative work. And again, not being tied to the fact that they have to be within physical groups. After a talk, actually, also in California, a number of years ago, a third grade teacher came up to me afterwards and said, "Okay, can you give me some more things that I can use tomorrow?" And we had talked about a lot of things that I have blown through today. But the two things, if nothing else, that you can do, the first is modeling. We know that there's a pretty big modeling effect in all different types of settings with parents and teachers. You may not think that your kids are watching you. If you have teenagers like myself, they will act like they don't know that you exist. That's what it's like to be a teenager, right? But they're still watching you constantly. And they are, in many ways, modeling the habits and the behaviors that you're also showing. So from a classroom perspective, if you're not sharing your personal creativity with people, if you're not talking about your little C creativity, if you're not talking about different ways that you can solve problems, or that you did solve problems, or if something goes wrong with the computer in your classroom, rather than saying, I need to get someone to come in here and help fix this, saying, hey, I'm gonna try to fix this. Can any of you help me do this? Or if you do get someone to come in and help, to say, okay, and then say this in front of your students, to say, okay, well, can you show me what you did so that I can fix it myself next time? You're sending really important messages to those students that it's good to be a creative problem solver. And that goes in family settings, if you're a principal or a superintendent, making sure that you're sharing your personal and your professional creativity, both the little c and the pro C creativity, is really, really important. It looks like pro creativity modeling is about a 10 to 20% bump in student creativity, believe it or not. The second thing, which I didn't have time to go into in any great depth today, and this is my last point in strategy. The one common characteristic of all big C creative creators, teams, individuals, whatever, is that they were very good at what we call creative articulation. And by that we mean they were very good at convincing other people that their ideas were the most creative. From Gandhi to Sigmund Freud to Bill Gates, Maya Angelou, I would say Emily Dickinson. She was not very good at that. Her sister-in-law was very good at it. And after Emily died, her sister-in-law is the one who took Emily's poems and went out and really became her biggest creativity champion. She articulated for her. Being able to convince other people that your ideas are really important is a key creativity and innovation skill for the rest of your life. Here's 2 quick ways that you can use this in school. The first one is giving students lots of opportunity to practice presenting their work to others. It doesn't have to be the whole school. It doesn't have to be the whole classroom. It can just be, again, pairs, pick one or two other people and pitch your idea to them. Share your project, tell them why your project is really good. But then also working with students to learn how to give constructive criticism. So not just to say, I hate your project because I hate you. That's not very constructive. But to say, you know what, I wonder if your project could be better if you tried this. That's constructive criticism. We just don't give students lots of opportunities across content areas to practice both of those highly related skills. And so I think that is incredibly, incredibly important. I know you don't have time to do that within your classroom for every single project assignment. I totally get that. But making sure that it's a routine activity so students become more and more comfortable with it is really, really important. The second way that you can use articulation is, and I do this with my own college students, is if a student turns something in and you don't get it, rather than giving them a bad grade, making sure you give them the opportunity to explain it to you. The best example that I can give of this, and I will close with this example, was that whenever I teach creativity to undergraduates, they have to create a real invention. They have to plan it out. They have to document their process. They have to build at least a prototype. Then they have to share it with the entire class, which then provides constructive criticism for them. And then at the end of the entire class, this is a very important part of the story, the students vote on which invention they would buy tomorrow if it were commercially available and what the most creative invention was. And I guess it's about 5 years ago now, 4 to 5 years, I had two young ladies in my creativity class invent a self-cleaning makeup brush. To this day, I do not understand it. And my comments were, I don't get it. This doesn't make any sense. Then I got the votes back from the rest of the class, and it was almost unanimously, a class of 50 undergraduates, all half men, half women, almost unanimously, they said that the self-cleaning makeup brush was the most creative invention, and it was the one that they would buy tomorrow, the men and the women. I sat back and said, you know what? I think the problem is me. I don't think it's them or their creativity. So I had them come to my office and I said, pitch it to me again so I can understand this better. And I gave them a second chance. I understood it a little bit better the second time, and it was clear that I was not their intended audience, but their intended audience thought the project was brilliant. They got a really good grade. If I hadn't given them that chance to articulate their own creative work, my comments wouldn't have been nearly as positive. They essentially turned a C plus, B minus project into an A plus project because they, in the end, they and their peers convinced me that I was wrong. So giving students the chance to defend their work to their peers and also to you is a really important creative skill that you can start using tomorrow. I would argue that teaching in online environments, it's almost a little bit easier to do that because your time by definition has to be a lot more flexible, right? So you can have students, if they're working on a project, record a pitch video that they then upload that you and others can see. They're not going to start out great, but over time they'll get better and better and better. And that's what we're trying to educate them for. Creative improvement over the long term. So I went a few minutes long there. I apologize. Here's all my contact information. Again, if you want copies of the slides, I did have to skip over a bunch. They were mostly examples and illustrations and stupid stories of mine, but if you just email me or tweet at me or LinkedIn at me, whatever, I will send you a copy of this. So thank you, and let's move over to the questions. All right. So Julia, if I remember correctly, if I hit answer live, people can see it, correct? I can't hear you, but I will assume that you said yes.
That's
Thank you.
correct.
Thank you. All right, let's
I had to unmute
answer.
myself.
That's fine. Allison Johnson asks a really good question here. Recommendations of activities or how to structure the week with remote learning for the next 2 months and being bombarded with worksheets and busy work to turn in from schools. You didn't ask this question, but this is my big concern with sort of personalized learning in general, Allison, is that people keep saying, oh, technology and personalized learning, it's going to change everything. But sort of the more elaborate models I see of it, it's just a high-tech way to have students do more worksheets. That's not necessarily highly differentiated learning. That's not necessarily pro-learning, pro-creativity. It's a very limited way to think about personalized learning. Fortunately, a lot of what we're seeing around the country right now as we're doing this is a lot more of giving students problem-based learning and more and things that they need to go off and work on and come back with. Even my wife, who is teaching 5-year-olds this year, when she had to move online, her school basically said, you don't have to do this if you don't want to, and because they're so young. So she only does it for about 40 minutes every single afternoon, but it's mostly they do a few things together like they would in school, but then it's her giving them scavenger hunts. It's her giving them science experiments to really simple stuff that you can do with stuff that you just have lying around your kitchen, and then having the students come back the next day to actually talk about those things. For my son's 8th grade class, his STEAM lab that they don't have any of their equipment. So what can they do? We have a PPE N95 mask shortage here like everyone else does. And so his teacher, she said, you all have 3 days to find plans and find a better way to create these masks. And it was really clever. It wasn't asking them just to go out and find the patterns that are all over the internet now, which is great. But it was a small creative spin on it, which is go out and see what others are doing. How could you design something better that might help with this shortage? And as you can imagine, those designs were all over the place, but they really involved a lot of personal creativity. I think projects like that, especially since it looks like almost no one's going to be back before the fall now. It'll be very surprising if that happens. Anything problem-based like that, you're capitalizing both on student interest, which is really important right now, so yeah, any sort of applied problem-based project, I think, is a much better bang for your buck, both in learning and creativity, than just more busy work, which it just doesn't seem to be too widespread across the country, but we know it's happening a little bit. So that was a very good question. Let me see. Jennifer Rix's question, can you please elaborate on your statement that Pro-C creativity modeled by teachers can bump student creativity by 20%? It's 10 to 20% in most studies, modeling effects. So if students see other people being creative and then have to do a creative task soon thereafter, having someone modeling it in front of them it just tends to be a very big bump. Another really easy thing that you can do tomorrow that is also about a 10 to 20% bump, sometimes a little higher, believe it or not. If you give students instructions and you have their, if the last instruction essentially gives them permission to be creative, probably the two most studied instructions in these studies, the first is just to say be creative or remember to be creative. If that's the last instruction, or the last instruction is try to think of ideas that no one else will think of, for whatever reason, I personally think it's permission giving, is that you're telling them, look, I know you're naturally creative. Don't worry about it. Go for it. Don't censor your own creativity. I think that makes a huge difference for students, especially fourth grade or later. You start seeing it in third and fourth grade where students start to self-censor their own creativity. In middle school up into high school, you see it really, really set in to the point that by the time I get your kids and your students in college, it's hard for me to get them to be creative because they just feel like that's a trap. And they don't want to take any creative and or intellectual learning risks, however you want to think about it. So it takes me, in some cases, a year or two to be working with students to get them to even take a small creative risk, because they've just reinforced it in their own mind that either they're not creative or you shouldn't be creative in order to be successful, which I think is just is crazy. Let me see here. That was a really good question. Tammy Emerson wants to know the story about the Seurat painting. It is a great story some other time. This one's easy. The name of the podcast is Bright Now, BRIGHTNOW. And if you just search for it wherever you do podcasts, it will pop right up. We just started the spring half of season 3. There's about 20 episodes so far, and we've recorded through the summer, so there's another 7 counting today's. This is a really good question from Suzanne Monthi. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Suzanne. I've read that interdisciplinary research teams are more effective. Can you speak to this in relation to what you've said about group work? This actually is one of the reasons why. Yes, that's true generally. Even on an interdisciplinary research team, the members have to be really comfortable with each other. If it's just you're bringing in people from all over and putting them together, until they reach a certain social comfort level, it's actually a negative creativity effect. So for any group team collaboration, whether it's a pair or it's a huge 20-person team, people do need to feel comfortable with each other. And it goes back to that attitude piece again. So this is a classic problem. So I was talking to someone in Washington, D.C., who was an engineering workforce specialist. And she said that it took them years to realize that employers who wanted to hire engineers kept telling them, we need engineers who can work in teams. And then they would bring that to deans of engineering schools who had said, yeah, we know, we've been listening. Every project, every assignment that these students do now is a team project. It took them years to realize that they were using the same terms for different things. In the workplace, it may be a team of 10 people or 50 people. There may be 3 engineers on the entire team. There's people from marketing, there's scientists, there's psychologists, there's statisticians, more than ever, statisticians and big data people, there's managers, there's maybe PR people, all these different perspectives to try to solve an interdisciplinary problem. All different strengths, all different weaknesses where you learn to mesh together. That's really hard to do. But what were they doing within colleges of engineering? It was people in the same class with similar interests and the same backgrounds solving the same problem with the same information. So students got pretty darn good at that. And then they went into the workforce and realized, oh wait, I'm the only engineer on this team. Like who else is going to help me with the engineering aspects of this? So interdisciplinary teams, They still have creativity issues, but they do tend to be more creative than I would say more domain consistent teams. That's not the best, or I guess disciplinary teams, to use the opposite word. But that means that you have to have students working in diverse collaborative teams to practice how to do that. And that's the tricky part that we're still trying to figure out how to get that to work, because in high school and college, students are taking courses with people who think a lot like them and have similar interests as them. It's like, where does the interdisciplinary happen? Well, if it only happens after they've graduated and started a job, why would we expect them to be anything but struggling at that? They've never done it before. So we've got to get better at this. I don't have any great solutions for you other than we've got to find ways to start practicing that younger and younger and younger. Do this one really quick from Victor Hernandez. Can you please rephrase how little c helps with pro C? Thank you. So we have no idea how little c becomes big C. We think little c becomes pro C level creativity, where you're using your everyday personal problem solving to solve sort of workplace problems. I would say, interpersonal and team problems too. It's a bit more sophisticated, a bit more applied, a bit more intentional. We're almost positive that pro C is what eventually becomes big C. We have no idea how that last step happens. There's lots of theories out there. My favorite theory is that historians are the one who turn it from pro C to big C, and that big C creativity is often determined in the rear view mirror. I just read a book about the 1920s, sort of the second Gilded Age. So like 1925 to 1928, before the Great Depression, sorry. And by far the most popular authors for that entire decade are people you have never heard of in your entire life. You know who didn't sell hardly any books? Hemingway, Fitzgerald. You could go down the list. It was decided decades later who the creative authors were. Same is true with science. Same is true with poetry. Again, Emily Dickinson, contrary to conventional wisdom, she did publish some of her poems. No one thought they were any good. It was literally her sister-in-law for a decade plus afterwards who kept trying to find those gatekeepers to appreciate Emily's work. So that's why I think pro C creativity is a good goal for us. Along the same lines, when I hear people say that the goal of gifted education is eminence, eminence is defined by others, not by you. And it's almost, not always, but it's very frequently defined after the fact. There weren't a lot of people when Bill Gates and Steve Jobs were in their famous war to invent the personal computer. Not a lot of people would have bet on those two guys to change the world. And there were times, even after they became famous, that people would have never said that about Steve Jobs, right? It was much later when analysts, tech historians, popular culture made those decisions. But we have no idea who in 30, 40, 50 years is going to be remembered as the eminent creators of our time. That changes with history. So again, everyone has little c creativity. Our goal is to try to work with students to get that into pro C creativity. Julia, do I have time to answer a couple more? Okay, good. So there's a lot of questions here for I want to make sure I get everybody. I'm going to try to answer 3 or 4 of these sort of rapid fire, because these are all excellent, excellent questions. Jeb per year writes, you just mentioned the academic risk taking. Could you speak to any research on how encouraging this is in students relates to creativity? I misread your question, but you know what I'm saying. Here's the thing with risk taking. A lot of students have seen enough Hollywood movies to believe that risk taking is that creativity is a justification for risk taking. Highly successful creative producers over the long haul are very good risk managers, not necessarily risk takers. There's a great quote that I cut for time today, but I kind of wish I hadn't now that we have this question. I can't remember it exactly, but it basically says that a person who is a truly creative person understands that they take risks but they have to manage all of their risks across lots of different ideas, because most of their ideas aren't going to work. So you can take little risks here and there, but it's about a portfolio of ideas that you're creating in life. And then she contrasted that with a person who thinks they're creative but isn't really. And her pithy comment was something like, I can't remember who the author was, but her pithy comment was something like, you can always tell who that person is because they have one idea that they cannot let go of. And that's because they've risked everything on that one idea. That's not how creative people work. They come up with lots of different ideas. They get some criticism, they get some feedback, they modify some of them, they drop some, they add some new ones in. They always have sort of this playground of different creative ideas. I've also described it this way. This is less than appropriate. It's the end of the day, I'm tired. Risk-taking is jumping off the roof to see if you can fly. Risk management is getting your friend to jump off the roof to see if they can fly. I am in no way advocating that people jump off roofs because you cannot fly. That said, that's a good way to keep that difference in mind, is managing risk versus just being risky. There's not a lot of research that says being risky is good for creativity. Managing risk well is very good for creativity and innovation. I'm not answering these fast enough. Let me just do a couple more. Fiz Anwar asks, which teaching methods to use in classrooms to fuel creativity in my middle school social studies subject? I think social studies is one of the best subject areas to be doing creative problem solving and just problem-based learning in general. I mean, the scenarios are written for you almost, right? We have history, we have all these current examples in the news. Coming up with problems, but then being very, very open to the fact that students will almost certainly come up with ideas that aren't right because you didn't think of them, or that a curriculum unit that you're using doesn't have written down. Students will almost always surprise you with an out of left field answer. Before saying, yeah, that doesn't really work, again, let them explain it to you. Let them walk it through, give them some feedback, have their peers give feedback. Being as open-ended as you possibly can, and really, so again, modeling that there's more than one right answer, even to an obvious problem, is really important. The best example of this that I can give is, I said that once, and there was a mathematician. It was a parent group. There was one of the parents was a mathematician, and she said to me afterwards, "Oh, like adding. There's so many different ways to add." And I said, and I quote, "What are you talking about? No, you just add numbers." And she pulled out a scratch piece of paper and showed me 3 completely distinct ways that people around the world add two-digit numbers together. I was flabbergasted. I would say, like, the most basic math skill other than counting, and it had never occurred to me there were very culturally defined ways of doing it, and that people in different parts of the world add differently. I mean, so if we can add differently, if 10 plus 10 equals 20 can be done in 5 different ways, then if we're giving students complex social studies problems to solve, there's going to be a million ways for them to actually solve it. So let me do one more. Julia, is that okay? One more? These are all such good questions. Oh, I wish I could answer like 10 more of these. Heather Morissette's question is, I see and constantly stand up to my kids' teachers who insist on making the kids copy even art step by step. Can you provide research that shows this is harmful? I mean, I don't know any study that specifically looked at how harmful that is. I would agree with you. It is very, very harmful. I think there is a slight advantage to learning basic technique. But when the purpose of education becomes just constant repetition and copying, there's very little creative benefit to that. So I could see if you were an art professor or an art teacher and you were trying to get students to understand how to draw a human hand, like for example, something that's very, very difficult, right? Sculpting, drawing human hands, my art friends say, is extremely hard to do. Even famous artists, you can tell in some of their paintings because they're hiding people's hands. Very, very difficult to do. Copying a really good artist or sculptor who does it well, I can see value in that. But then after a while, you have to go out and paint, draw, sculpt your own hands. Like you can't. It's not just copying. Copying is great for regurgitation. I think the research is pretty clear from constructivism, sociocultural theory, certainly cognitive science, that the repetition drill and kill is helpful for certain basic skills and facts, but not for anything more complex or more higher order. And it can be bad if that's all that you're doing. You need those really involved problem-based experiences. And they're actually, we don't have studies on this yet, but we really, really need them. In that a number of years ago, people who were doing problem-based learning, kind of from a social constructivist lens, kind of, I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but about 15, maybe 20 years ago, they started doing studies where they replaced most of the drill and kill curriculum with problem-based learning activities. What they found over time, Heather, was that student test scores did not go up. But they didn't go down. So by removing all of that stuff they had to memorize and having them learn it through intense problem-based activities that the students were super amped up to dive into each day, like super applied, cool projects and scenarios, the students learned just as much. They didn't lose anything, and they were much more motivated to continue learning. We need more studies like that so that when teachers say, look, I'm worried about these test scores, we can say, we are too. We want our children to know things, but doing this doesn't hurt you with their test scores. We just don't have enough research on that yet. I'm 99.9% certain that the research will show that because we have these smaller studies sprinkled over the last 15 years. But with that, you've all been very, very patient. That's exactly 60 minutes. I'm very, very conscious that we're all zoomed out for the most part, so I don't want to take advantage of your patience. But thank you all very much. Please let me know again if you want copies of the PowerPoint, and feel free to contact me with any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Plucker. It was an honor hearing you speak on creativity, and we are so grateful that you were able to provide us this insight for the CAG Access webinar. Attendees, please consider donating to CAG to continue these CAG Access webinars. You can donate as little as $5. The link is in the chat box. Thank you all so much, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.